My name is Wendy Thomas, and I am 29 years old, and I am a registered nurse. Let her go, we won't pay for the surgery. Those were the words my father said to the doctor while I lay in a coma with tubes in my throat and my heart barely beating. He said it the way you would cancel a subscription you no longer need. No hesitation and no trembling in his voice. He signed the Do Not Resuscitate order at 11:18 on a Tuesday night. He did not do it because the doctors said I was beyond saving. He did it because the billing department gave him a number. That was all it took. Just a number. When I woke up 3 weeks later, bruised and broken and barely able to lift my own head, I discovered that the signature on that form was not even the worst thing he had done while I was unconscious. What I did in the next 24 hours did not just change my life, it collapsed his entire world. He never saw it coming because he forgot one single thing about me. Let me take you back 7 months earlier to the day my grandmother died and everything started to unravel. Was born with a hole in my heart. When I was 4 years old, they opened my chest for a massive surgery. The operation took 11 hours, but it took my parents 20 years to forget the bill. Actually, it took my mother 20 years to forget, but my father never did. You know how much you cost this family, Wendy. I was 8 years old the first time he said that to me. I had asked for new sneakers because mine had a crack in the sole, and my socks got wet every time it rained. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of medical bills, and he did not even look up. $214,000. That is what you cost us. I did not get the sneakers. By the time I was 12, I stopped asking for anything at all. At 15, I was babysitting at 3 houses on our block just to pay for my own school supplies. At 18, I signed my first student loan alone, while my older sister Meredith packed for the state university that my parents were funding in full. Nobody questioned it. Meredith got a car at 16 while I rode the bus. Meredith had her tuition paid while I had a repayment plan. Meredith got birthday dinners at expensive restaurants, while I got a cake from a box and a card signed by my mother only. And I accepted all of it. That is the part that is hardest to explain now. I was not angry. I genuinely believed I owed them. My father had repeated it so many times that I cost the family everything that the debt felt as real as the scar on my chest. I carried it the way I carried my nurse badge every single day without thinking. The only person who never mentioned that debt was my grandmother Lillian. Lillian Price lived alone in a small brick house on Elm Street in Pennsylvania. It had a porch swing that creaked when the wind blew. She had lived there for 41 years and raised my mother there and buried my grandfather from there. I started visiting her every Saturday when I was 23. I was fresh out of nursing school and drowning in student debt, but I would drive 40 minutes each way to bring her groceries and check her blood pressure. We would sit on that porch swing and she would listen to me talk. She never once said that I owed her. She said things like, "Tell me about your week, sweetheart," and "Did you eat today?" And once near the end, with her hands shaking and her voice barely a whisper, she said something I did not understand at the time. "I have taken care of things for you, Wendy, and when the time comes, a man named Kessler will find you." I just smiled and squeezed her hand. I thought she was confused because of her age, but she was sharp until her last breath. My father hated that I visited her. "You are wasting gas," he would say. "She does not even remember your name." That was a lie. Lillian remembered everything, including things my father wished she would forget. She died on a Thursday in March quietly, in her sleep. My father organized the funeral to be small and quick. He did not let me read a eulogy. "Keep it short," he said at the door of the funeral home. "We are not making a spectacle." I stood in the back row and said goodbye in silence. Lillian had said Kessler would find me, but I did not know who that was. It would take a coma and a signed death order before that name meant anything at all. 3 months after the funeral of my grandmother, I was driving home from a 12-hour overnight shift at the hospital. It was 4:17 in the morning on Route 202 in a light rain. I remember the clock on my dashboard so clearly because I was busy calculating how many hours of sleep I could get before my next shift. I figured I would get 6 hours if I skipped breakfast, or 5 if I decided to shower. I never got to make that choice. A pickup truck ran a red light doing 50 miles per hour and hit the driver's side of my car so hard that the metal frame folded inward like a piece of paper. I do not remember the sound of the impact or the glass shattering. I am told I was conscious for only about 90 seconds after the crash, which was just long enough for the paramedic to hear me whisper my name before I drifted into nothingness. I suffered traumatic brain swelling, 4 broken ribs, and internal hemorrhaging. The emergency room team at St. Catherine's, which happened to be my own hospital where I clocked in and out 5 days a week, opened me up within the hour, but the bleeding would not stop. They needed a second surgery and a specialist and more time in the operating room. Most importantly, someone had to authorize it. I had no husband and no children. The emergency contact on my hospital file was the same name that had been there since I was 18, because my father had always insisted on it. Gerald Thomas was listed as my next of kin. They called him at 10:30 that night, and he arrived 17 minutes later. I know the exact time because the front desk logged it. He did not go to my room first. He did not ask the nurse how I was doing or if I was in pain, or if I had woken up at all. He walked straight to the billing department and he asked one single question. How much is this going to cost? I learned what happened next from a woman named Patricia Walsh. Everyone at the hospital called her Pat. She was our head nurse with 28 years on the floor and a voice like gravel. Pat was at the nurse's station when my father walked out of the billing office and found Dr. Richard Hale, who was the surgeon managing my case. She heard every single word of their conversation. My father asked for an estimate on the second surgery. Dr. Hale told him it would be between $180,000 and $240,000, depending on complications. Insurance would cover some, but there would be significant out-of-pocket costs, especially because my father was a co-signer on my old medical accounts. He had insisted on that when I was 18, and I thought it was a kindness, but it was actually a leash. My father did not even blink. He told the doctor that I did not have a healthcare proxy, and that as my father, he was the sole decision maker. Dr. Hale nodded because that is the protocol when no legal paperwork is on file. And then my father said the words that should have been my end. Let her go, we won't pay for the surgery. Pat told me later that the doctor just stared at him in shock. My father did not look away. He said that I had been a financial drain my whole life, and then he signed the Do Not Resuscitate order. His hand was steady, and he did not hesitate for a second. He put the pen down and asked if there was anything else he needed to sign before walking toward the elevator. He did not visit my room or look through the glass to say goodbye. Pat stood behind the station counter, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles were white. She wanted to scream, but she did something much better instead. She sat down and opened my employee file. Every nurse at St. Catherine's fills out an emergency packet during onboarding. Most people skip the healthcare proxy section, but I had not. 3 years before that night, I had signed my proxy over to Deborah Owens, who was my best friend from nursing school. It was listed clearly with her phone number and relationship. Pat found it in under 2 minutes. She called Deborah at 11:14, and Deborah picked up on the second ring. Pat told her everything: the accident and the coma, and the father who had just signed an order to let his daughter die. Deborah did not ask questions. She just said, "I am leaving now." She drove 90 minutes through the rain and walked into the hospital at nearly 1 a.m. with her license and a copy of the proxy form she had kept in her own filing cabinet. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was firm. She revoked the order and authorized the surgery immediately. Dr. Hale was back in his scrubs within the hour. My father was already home by then, probably asleep. As far as he knew, the machines would stop, and the hospital would call him in the morning with the news of my passing. Pat did not call him, and neither did Deborah. Instead, Pat did one more thing before her shift ended. She opened an internal incident report and documented every word my father had said with the exact timestamps. She filed it and locked her computer. Gerald Thomas went to sleep that night, believing his daughter would be dead by morning. He slept soundly, and he had no idea he was about to make a second mistake that would cost him everything he owned. My father woke up the next morning expecting a phone call from the hospital to confirm the time of my death. He had already rehearsed what he would tell our relatives and the people at church. I could almost hear the practiced catch in his voice and see him placing a hand over his heart as he explained that the injuries were just too severe and we lost her. Nos vanok takin epistopil. Not because anyone told him I was alive, but simply because the hospital had no reason to contact him anymore. Rather than calling to check on his youngest daughter or driving down to the morgue, Gerald Thomas spent that Wednesday morning doing something else entirely. He went to steal my house. Here is what I did not know at the time and what I would not learn until weeks later. My grandmother Lillian had already transferred the Norristown house into my name before she died. The deed was handled through her personal attorney, and it was clean and legal and filed with the county. My father had no idea this had happened. What he did know was that Lillian was gone, and the house was sitting empty, and he believed it was his right to claim it. To do this, he used a power of attorney document with my signature on it. Except I had never signed any such thing. He had carefully traced my handwriting from old medical consent forms, those same forms he had made me sign when I was barely 18, and too intimidated to ask questions. He brought that forged document to a notary. He knew a man named Carl, who owed him a favor and was happy to look the other way. Carl stamped the paper, and Gerald filed the deed transfer at the county recorder office that same afternoon. By Thursday, the house was officially in his name. By Friday, he had walked into a bank and taken out a mortgage against the property for $280,000 in cash. That money did not go toward my medical bills or into a savings account for the family. It went straight to pay off gambling debts that nobody in our family or our church even knew existed. He had no idea the house was already mine, and he certainly did not know about the man my grandmother had called Kessler. But the problem with forged signatures is that they only hold up as long as nobody looks closely, and someone was about to look very closely. I opened my eyes on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the accident. The light was that flat blue-white color that only exists in hospitals. I knew that light well because I had worked under it for 6 years, but I had never been on this side of it before. My throat was raw and my chest ached with every breath. Everything felt heavy, and even blinking took a massive effort. The first face I saw was not my father or my sister. It was Pat. She was standing by the window watching my monitors, and when she saw my eyes open, she did not gasp. She simply pulled a chair to my bedside and took my hand in hers. "You are safe," she said. "I need to tell you some things, but only when you are ready." I tried to speak, but my voice was a cracked whisper. I asked how long I had been out. 3 weeks, she told me. The surgery went well, and you are going to be fine. I closed my eyes again, trying to piece together the memory of the truck and the red light. Later that afternoon, at exactly 2:17, my father walked into the room. I watched his face carefully as he stood in the doorway. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of something else before his expression rearranged itself into the mask of a grieving parent. I have spent years reading faces in the intensive care unit, and I know that the fear of losing someone looks very different from the fear of being caught. He rushed to my bedside and grabbed my hand with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart, we were so scared," he cried. "Thank God you're okay." I looked at him and his trembling lip, and I managed to say, "Hi, Dad." My sister Meredith sent flowers later that evening, but she did not come to visit. 2 days later, when I was strong enough to sit up, Pat waited until the hallway was quiet and the door was closed. She sat down and looked me in the eye. She told me that on the night of my accident, my father had come to the hospital only once. She told me how he asked about the cost of the surgery, and how he lied about the healthcare proxy. And then she told me the words he said to the surgeon: "Let her go, we won't pay for the surgery. She has been a financial drain her whole life." I sat there in the silence of the hospital room, listening to the steady beep of the monitor. I was not surprised. I finally had the words for a truth I had felt my entire life. I was a line item on a ledger. I was a cost that never stopped growing. I asked Pat how I was still alive, and she told me about Deborah and the proxy form in my employee file. It was all there in an incident report with timestamps and witnesses. I asked Pat for my phone, and I ignored the dozens of missed calls from my father and sister. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name my grandmother had given me: Kessler. When he answered the phone, his voice was calm and measured. He told me he had been trying to reach me for 4 months, but someone at my old address told him I had moved out of state and did not want to be contacted. That was my father's voice. I told him I was in the hospital and that I had been in a coma. There was a pause on the line, and then he told me that Lillian had come to his office 2 years before she died to make a private will. The house on Elm Street and a trust account with $85,000 were left solely to me. No other names and no conditions. I asked him if the house was still in my name. He told me he would check the current records and call me back within the hour. As I hung up, I realized my grandmother had planned for this moment. She knew exactly what my father would try to do. The phone rang exactly 53 minutes later. This time, the voice of Donald Kessler had an edge to it. It was the controlled tension of a professional who had just discovered something truly wrong. "Miss Thomas," he said, "the deed to your grandmother property was transferred out of your name 3 weeks ago." I stared at the IV drip on my arm and counted the drops one by one. I asked him who it was transferred to. "Gerald Thomas," he replied. "He used a power of attorney." I told him right then that I never signed a power of attorney. Kessler sighed and said he knew that because he held the original deed from probate, which was notarized by his own office. His assessment was simple. It was a forgery. But there was more. Kessler had run a lien search and found that a mortgage for $280,000 had been recorded against the house just 6 days prior. The number sat in the room like a heavy weight. My father had leveraged my grandmother home to get cash. I reached for a pen on my bedside table, and my hand was surprisingly steady. I wrote down every detail Kessler gave me: the mortgage amount, the recording date, and the name of the notary who stamped the document. Kessler asked if I wanted to press charges right then, but I told him not yet. I wanted to see how deep this betrayal went first. Before we hung up, Kessler mentioned one more thing. My grandmother had left a sealed letter for me. She had insisted that it be delivered to me in person and only to me. I asked him to come to the hospital the following morning at 9. After I hung up, I turned to Pat, who had been standing by the window the entire time. I asked her for the exact time my father signed that Do Not Resuscitate order. 11:18 p.m., she said. I wrote that down too. The next afternoon, my father visited again. He brought a bouquet of yellow roses and a container of banana bread that my sister had baked. He sat by my bed and squeezed my hand with the weary sigh of a man carrying an enormous burden. He was so good at this performance. I had watched him play the role of the sacrificial provider my entire life. At church potlucks and holiday dinners, everyone saw him as the man who gave everything and never complained. He told me the doctors said I would be out in a week and that the family would take care of the medical bills together. "That is what families do," he said. I looked at him and smiled back, even though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. I repeated his words, "as a family." He looked satisfied, believing his script was still working on me. He talked about the weather and a plumbing job he had finished while my sister Meredith stood at the foot of the bed staring at her phone. They stayed for 40 minutes, and then they left. As soon as the door closed, I called Kessler and told him to bring the letter. Donald Kessler arrived the next morning looking exactly as I imagined. He was a quiet man in a gray suit with silver-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase that had seen decades of use. He shook my hand, minding the IV lines, and handed me a manila envelope. It had my name written in my grandmother's thin but steady handwriting. I broke the seal and read the single sheet of paper inside. "Wendy," she wrote, "I know your father will try to take everything. He already took my pension and my savings over the years, but I never told you because I did not want to break the family apart. That was my mistake. Do not make it yours." The letter continued, with a warning that the house and the money were mine, and that I should not let anyone take them, especially not my father. "You are stronger than me, sweetheart," she wrote, "and I am sorry I did not say this while I could still hold your hand." I cried then for the first time since waking up. I did not cry because I felt weak, but because my grandmother had truly seen me. She had planned for this moment quietly and carefully with a love that did not need an audience. Kessler waited for me to compose myself and then placed a thick folder on my bed. It contained the original will, the probate records, and the proof of the fraudulent mortgage. "You have everything you need," he told me. He asked what I wanted to do next. I told him I wanted to do this the right way. I wanted to do it publicly, and I wanted it done before Sunday. Kessler raised an eyebrow and asked what was happening on Sunday. I told him that our church was holding its monthly community gathering. My father was a deacon there, and he never missed it. 5 days after I woke up, the hospital staff discharged me. I was still sore, and my body was covered in bruises that had turned a dull yellow, but I could walk and I could think. Most importantly, I could finally make my own decisions. My father arrived at the hospital at 10 in the morning to pick me up. He had brought a suitcase, and he did not ask me where I wanted to go. He simply announced that I would be staying with him and my mother until I recovered. It was his typical tone of authority that left no room for argument. I looked at him and said that it was kind of him, but I told him that Deborah was picking me up instead. I explained that she had a spare room ready for me. His face changed instantly. The mask did not slip completely, but the corners of his mouth tightened into a hard line. He asked why I would rather stay with a stranger than my own family. I reminded him that Deborah was not a stranger, and that she had been my emergency contact for 3 years. A flicker of calculation moved behind his eyes, but he did not connect the dots to the healthcare proxy just yet. He picked up the empty suitcase and walked out of the room without saying a word of goodbye. That evening, my sister Meredith sent me a text message, saying that Dad was upset and that I was being ungrateful after everything he had been through. I read the message and set my phone down on the table without responding. Later that night at Deborah's apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and called Donald Kessler. We went over the timeline one more time. He confirmed that the legal motions were ready. We had a court motion to void the fraudulent deed, a police report for forgery, and a notification ready for the mortgage lender regarding the disputed title. Everything was in order for Sunday. My father called me one last time that night. His tone was casual, almost rehearsed. He mentioned grandmother house and said he had been handling all the estate matters, so I should not worry about it. He told me he would explain everything once I was feeling better. He was testing the waters to see if I knew anything. I simply told him, "Okay, Dad," and thanked him for taking care of it. When I hung up, Deborah asked me how I could sound so calm. I told her it was because I had 29 years of practice dealing with him. To understand what happened next, you have to know about my father's church. Grace Community Church was a place where everyone knew your name and what you brought to the last potluck. My father, Gerald Thomas, had been a deacon there for 15 years. He was the man who ushered people at the door and read scripture from the lectern. He organized the men breakfasts and fixed people furnaces for free. The pastor often called him a man of faith and sacrifice. It was a phrase I had heard so many times, it made my teeth ache. Every first Sunday of the month, the church held a community potluck in the fellowship hall. There would be folding tables and rows of casserole dishes, and a standing microphone at the front where people shared their blessings. My father always spoke. He always talked about the importance of family and giving without expecting anything in return. More than 100 people believed every word he said. On Saturday evening, I called Kessler and asked him to be at the church by 11:30 the next morning. I spent that night sitting on the couch and breathing deeply despite the ache in my ribs. I was not planning to cause a scene. I was simply planning to have a conversation. But I knew that when 100 people are in a room, every conversation becomes a stage. Sunday morning arrived, and I stood in front of the mirror. The bruise on my jaw was almost gone, and the one under my eye had faded to a faint green. I put on a clean white shirt and black slacks. I did not wear any jewelry, except for the small silver studs my grandmother had given me for my 21st birthday. I picked up the manila folder containing the will, the deed, records, and the hospital incident report. I slid it into my bag and walked out the door. Deborah drove me in silence. When we turned onto the church road and saw the white steeple shining in the sun, she asked if I was sure about this. I told her I had never been more sure of anything in my life. When we arrived at the church, I saw Donald Kessler waiting near the entrance. He was dressed in his usual gray suit and held his leather briefcase with the calm patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. He gave me a single nod as I walked through the front doors. Inside, the service was already underway. The air was warm and smelled of old carpet and coffee. I slipped into the very last pew and sat down. My father was sitting in the front row, and when he heard the door open, he turned around. When he saw me, his face lit up with the expression of a proud and grateful father. He raised his hand and waved. I gave him a small, patient wave back. The service ended at noon, and the congregation moved into the fellowship hall. It was a wide room with fluorescent lights and rows of tables covered in foil pans of baked ziti and green bean casserole. The standing microphone at the front was already plugged in and humming quietly. My father was already standing next to it. He always took charge of these moments. He waited for the room to settle and for the children to stop darting between the tables before he tapped the mic to get everyone's attention. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began. "I want to start with something personal today." The room went quiet. He told the congregation about my accident and how I had been in a coma for 3 weeks. He said the doctors were not sure I would make it, but that God is faithful. Then he turned and gestured toward me. "Today Wendy is here with us," he announced. Every head in the room turned toward the back wall where I was standing. The applause was warm and genuine. I saw people pressing their hands to their hearts. As a father, Gerald continued, and I could hear his voice cracking at exactly the right moment. "There is nothing more terrifying than almost losing your child. I prayed every single night, and I never left her side." I felt those words land in my chest, like a key turning in a lock. He told a room of 100 people that he never left my side, when in reality he had signed my death warrant and walked away. Family is everything, he said, looking directly at me with his arms open for an embrace. That is what I have always taught my girls. I smiled back and began walking toward him. The room watched us with soft, expectant eyes. When I reached the front, I asked him if I could say a few words. He did not hesitate. He could not say no in front of everyone. He handed me the microphone with a wide, confident smile and stepped to the side to play the supporting role. I wrapped my fingers around the warm metal of the mic and looked out at the faces in the room. "Thank you all for your prayers," I said. "I am truly grateful to be standing here, but I need to correct something my father just said." The room went perfectly still. I saw my father's smile fade by a fraction. I told them that my father did not pray by my bedside and that he was only at the hospital once on the night of the accident. I explained that he did not come to check on me but went straight to the billing department to ask about the cost of the surgery. I could feel him shifting uncomfortably beside me, but I did not turn around. I told the congregation his exact words, which were documented in a hospital report. "Let her go, we won't pay for the surgery. She has been a financial drain her whole life." A woman in the front row covered her mouth in shock. I explained that I was only alive because a nurse found my healthcare proxy and called a friend who drove through the rain to save me. My father stepped forward and tried to tell me to stop. He said I was confused and that the medication was affecting my mind. I looked him in the eye and told him I was not done. I told him he chose a church to lie, and I was choosing the same church to tell the truth. At that moment, the side door of the fellowship hall opened, and Donald Kessler walked in. He walked directly to the front and set his briefcase on a table. For the first time in my life, I saw my father look genuinely afraid. I introduced Mr. Kessler to the room and explained that he was the attorney for my grandmother Lillian. I told them that she had left her house and her savings solely to me because she did not trust my father. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I told everyone how my father had forged my signature to steal the house and take out a mortgage while I was in a coma. Gerald shouted that it was a lie, but Kessler simply opened his briefcase and lifted the original will for everyone to see. He confirmed that my father's name did not appear anywhere in the document. I lowered the microphone and spoke directly to my father. I told him I was not there to humiliate him, but because he had tried to let me die and then robbed me. Gerald turned to the room and his jaw was set tight. His eyes were scanning the crowd looking for an ally or a friendly face or anyone who might still be on his side. "She is on heavy medication," he said to the congregation. His voice was tight but controlled as he told them that I did not know what I was saying and that this was a private family matter. But nobody answered him. The room was a wall of folded arms and unblinking eyes. Then a voice from the back row asked a question that cut through the tension. "Why is there a lawyer here, Gerald?" My father did not answer. His eyes moved to Pastor David, who was standing near the coffee station with his hands in his pockets. Gerald, the pastor, said quietly, "I think we should all hear this out." My father shifted his weight and changed his tactics the way he always did when authority failed him. He softened his posture and let his voice break as he claimed he had sacrificed everything for the family. He told the room that my medical bills had nearly bankrupted them when I was a child, and that he only did what he thought was best. I did not even need the microphone to answer him. I told him that he did what was cheapest, and that there was a big difference. He began to talk about the pressure he was under and the debts he owed, but he stopped himself before he could admit too much. My sister Meredith stood up from her chair then. Her face was white as a sheet. "Dad, stop talking," she said. Gerald grabbed her arm and told her to tell everyone he was just trying to protect the family. But Meredith pulled her arm free. She looked at me and then at the exit. "I cannot do this," she said. As she passed me on her way to the door, she whispered 6 words that I will carry for the rest of my life. I should have called Deborah myself. And then she was gone. I watched the door close behind my sister and turned back to the congregation. I told them I was not sharing this to destroy my father, but because he had stood at that microphone for 15 years, telling them who he was. I told them they deserved to know the truth. I turned to Gerald, who was standing with his back against the wall. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. I told him exactly what was going to happen next. I explained that Mr. Kessler had already filed a motion to void the deed transfer because it was based on a forgery. I told him the bank had been notified and the loan was frozen. I mentioned the police report for forgery and fraud, and that the notary who helped him was named in it too. I told my father that he would be required to return the full $280,000 or face criminal charges. His voice came out raw as he asked if I would really send my own father to jail. I looked at him straight on and reminded him that he had signed a paper to let his own daughter die. The fellowship hall held its breath. I told him I was not sending him anywhere, but I was giving him a chance to make things right. That was more than he had ever given me. Kessler closed his briefcase with a soft click and told my father that this was not a negotiation. Gerald looked around the room one last time at the people he had known for decades, the men whose pipes he had fixed, and the women who brought him coffee. They all looked back at him, but none of them moved toward him. Finally, a deacon named Robert walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. It was not a tender gesture. "Gerald, I think you should leave," Robert said. My father stood up and walked toward the door. His shoes made no sound on the floor. At the threshold, he turned and looked at me with red eyes, as if he wanted to say one final line to win the room back. But nothing came out. He left, and the room remained silent. I set the microphone down and apologized to everyone for disrupting their Sunday. I told them my grandmother would have wanted the truth spoken in this place. Within 24 hours, everything Gerald Thomas had built came apart. The bank froze the mortgage on Monday morning after their fraud department spoke with Kessler. The title was flagged, and the loan was suspended. My father could not access the funds, and the $280,000 he had already spent was now a debt that belonged to him alone. The county court accepted the motion to void the deed, and Gerald was served with a summons at his home that afternoon. The neighbors watched from their porches as the process server knocked on his door. By Tuesday, the notary named Carl had already hired an attorney and was cooperating with the police investigation into the forgery. Word traveled through the church faster than any sermon. My father was asked to step down as a deacon by a unanimous vote. He did not even show up to the meeting to defend himself. His plumbing clients began to cancel their appointments one by one, and some sent messages telling him never to come to their homes again. He called me late that night and told me that I had destroyed him. I told him that I had not destroyed anything. I had simply stopped covering for him. One more thing surfaced that week. Kessler discovered that 3 years earlier, my father had changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy to himself, using another forged signature. He had a plan for every version of my death, and none of them included saving me. When my sister Meredith called me a few days later, she was crying. She admitted that she knew about the Do Not Resuscitate order and the plan to take the house. She told me she was scared of him and that he had promised her a share of the money to keep her quiet. I told her that fear was not an excuse for what she did. She told me our grandmother had sent her a letter too, telling her she was too much like our father and urging her to choose differently. A month later, the deed to the house on Elm Street was officially back in my name. Kessler told me to thank my grandmother and said she would have loved watching me stand up for the truth. Gerald faced criminal charges for forgery and mortgage fraud. His attorney advised a plea deal of probation and full restitution to avoid prison time. He had to sell his own house to cover the debts, but it was not enough. He moved away to live with a relative in another city, and I never looked back. Meredith lost some of her real estate listings because people in the community remembered what had happened. People always remember. I went back to work at the hospital, and eventually I drove to Norristown on a Saturday in late October. I parked my car on Elm Street and walked up to the brick house with the creaking porch swing. I turned my key in the door and stepped inside. The first thing I smelled was lavender from the sachets my grandmother kept in every drawer. I sat in her rocking chair and just stayed there in the silence. For the first time in my life, I was in a home that was mine. not because I had earned someone's approval, but because I was loved. I used to believe that being a good daughter meant staying silent and absorbing the guilt my father threw at me. I thought love required obedience and gratitude, even when it hurt. I was wrong. Setting a boundary is not about revenge, it is about survival. Sometimes survival looks like a stack of papers and the courage to tell the truth out loud. I do not hate my father because hating him would mean he still controls me. He is simply a man who made terrible choices, and I no longer have to carry his weight on my shoulders. I still go to church, but it is a different one now. It has a smaller congregation and friendlier coffee. I sit in the front row every week. I do not do it because I need to be seen. I do it because I am finally done hiding in the back.